And the title of the presentation that I'd like to take everyone through is Delivery Success Factors in a Virtual World. So the objectives of this presentation today, to summarise how the way we work has had to change in 2020 via a simple relationship model, to use a combination of theory and also my own personal experiences to provide some insights, and potentially to identify factors that may make a difference to your virtual work world or worlds, and to provide some links to related articles that provide further food for thought. So in terms of the genesis of this pack, Louise and I were talking when we were sort of planning the symposium and trying to come up with a way of sharing some observations and some insights from different organisations, but also to try to provide a holistic framework about how we can present those. So I do have a few more words in a number of these slides, but the intent is really to have a pack that can be downloaded, saved, manipulated, and potentially used in your own environments. So I'd like to start on a lighter note, and I wish I had one of Neil Creasy's tools that might have a laugher meter or something like that. I'm not sure whether any of those exist just yet or not, but I'd like to start with a new history of evolution. So I'm sure most of us are familiar with the evolution from the swamp up to Neanderthals and up to Homo sapiens. And then some of you might have also seen, you know, potentially the 21st century version of this, which has the person sitting at the computer. Now, my own thoughts about this little diagram, the guy actually looks quite calm and serene and in control, or the person, I should say. And I'm not sure that that's completely accurate either, at least in terms of the last 6 or 7 months. So perhaps we can replace that last little picture by somebody like that who's typing furiously and scowling and maybe a little bit frustrated. So that to me is sort of a representation in some ways of the world that we're working in and living in at the moment. So let's expand on this concept of evolution. Homo sapiens, according to Britannica, has existed for more or less 300,000 years. The internet as we know it has existed for only 30 years, and many of us will recall the days of dial-in modems and where bandwidths were impossible to actually support video in a manageable way. You know, download speeds were very, very slow, so we almost used voice and phone still as the default communication mechanism. Video conferencing has existed for around 15 years, perhaps a year or two longer than that. And, you know, we're sort of talking about the Skypes and some of the early pioneers in that space. But I think it's fair to say for much of that intervening period from approximately 2005 to now, most people would say they still preferred face-to-face, and video conferencing was kind of second best and, you know, used in case of emergency and probably only a primary mechanism for engaging for remote teams or offshore teams. And then we have this concept now of virtual work, and I kind of use that animation on purpose because this virtual work model has kind of clobbered everything that has come before us and forced us to work in a new way, whether we like it or not. So what are some of the observations out of this history of evolution? We are intelligent beings. We're proving that we can grow and adapt very, very quickly, but our bodies are actually hardwired to communicate and connect in a physical world. And some of the commentary from earlier presentations today is about, in a number of instances, preferences to still meet people for a real coffee rather than a physical coffee. And you know, this is the reality of the bodies that we inhabit. The other observation is that physiologically and psychologically, it's difficult to adapt. It's not impossible to adapt. It's not that everybody experiences it in the same way, but it can be difficult to adapt. So now, those are some individual observations and trying to link that to evolution. now I wanted to sort of expand the range of the conversation, if you will, into work perspectives. And some follow-on thoughts there are not only do individuals need to adapt to the virtual world, but teams and organisations also have this need to adapt. And I guess we've developed a simple relationship model to try to illustrate a number of these components concurrently. So I've started with a very basic three-cornered diagram with an organisation, a team and an individual perspective. I've tried to find a more fluid way of representing the interrelationship between each of these elements. The organisation doesn't need to be at the top of the hierarchy, although that's the way a lot of us think. I'm really trying to demonstrate the interplay between these components here. And from here, what I'd like to do is present a view of the things that flow to and from each of these perspectives, certainly in a pre-virtual world, and then contrast that with what we're experiencing in our current world. So firstly, what has historically an organisation provided a team? A lot of these things will be self-evident, things like an organisational strategy and overall organisation objectives. Resources can be floor space, laptops, phones, tools, technologies, those sorts of things. The physical workplace, which is a place to sit, and ideally that's all been gone through an OH&S procedure, so it's fit for purpose and standardised to some extent. There are also organisational policies and procedures that, whether they're at the forefront of our mind or not, are there to help teams. So they can be things like reasonable hours of work, how business processes work, how PMOs work, and those sorts of things. Team security is an interesting one. So in certainly financial services organisations, there's often the concept of Chinese walls, which means that it would be conflict of interest for Team A to know what Team B is working on. So there's the concept of where the team sits and works and how it can interact in return. And the final thing, which I guess is the first introduction of a concept through the remaining slides, is of cadence. So an organisation often provides a cadence to the team about how it expects the team to work. For a financial services organisation, it's probably 8 till 5 or 8 till 6. For a fruit and vegetable organisation, it's probably very early in the morning to about midday. There might be work on Saturdays and Sundays as well, and these are the sorts of things that are in place for an organisation to be able to survive, if not thrive. In the opposite direction, from a team to an organisation, again, presenting this simplistically, a team will provide its own, or the project outcomes and outputs back to the organisation as a realisation of the business strategy and the business objectives, and might also provide some team learnings back to the organisation in terms of what works well, what doesn't work well. I'd just like to emphasise at this point, this is intended to be quite a simple model. I haven't tried to incorporate things like external vendor organisations or the concept of contractors versus employees or those sorts of things. I'm trying to be a little more broad brush than that. The next relationship that I wanted to describe a little more detail is organisation to individual. So again, quite straightforward to understand if presented this way. The organisation hires the individual and gives them a reason for being there. Going back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, the wages and the benefits are sort of foundational to the individual's ability to exist. Other benefits such as sick leave, annual leave, bonuses and so on. The organisation provides the individual with their own individual physical workplace, organisational policies and procedures, which can often overlap with the team policies and procedures. So this could include things like OH&S, harassment policies, fair work policies, and those sorts of things. Individual workplace tools, and physical security. So the concept of going into a building, into an office, and having that secured is something that we've just taken for granted in a lot of instances, and sort of expect it to be there. The final point, again, one of these things that will recur through the remaining content is social connectivity. So almost accidentally in some instances, the individual has the opportunity to socialise and connect just by turning up to the organisation through virtue of business relationships, friendships, and providing that sort of water cooler opportunity, even if we don't regularly stand at water coolers and have water cooler conversations. Final relationship I'd like to talk about on this slide is, one more diagram here before I move to team and individual. Individual to an organisation. So the individual provides back to the organisation his or her own skills, often an element of workplace care. So things like monitoring whether PowerPoints have been left on or there's other unsafe situations, reporting conflicts of interest, etc., etc. Individual work outputs as opposed to team and project work outputs, and also some individual learnings back to the organisation. Team to individual now, and this is the final sort of section of the build of this slide. The team provides an individual, I guess, a team role rather than a generic role. Generic role might be something like a project manager, whereas a team role can be more nuanced and fine-tuned than that. The team can provide team objectives to the individual, team policies and procedures as distinct from organisational policies and procedures, a team level of social connectivity, and a team level of work cadence. So what that recognises often in larger organisations where there might be multiple offices or multiple departments, it's not fair to assume that every team needs to work in the same way to be effective. Now, the final aspect of this for the individual back to the team is very similar to what I've described for the individual to the organisation. The individual provides his or her skills, team level outputs, and team level learnings. So with that sketch and sort of step through, now I'd like to describe some key changes in our new virtual world. And I've just tried to do this with some strike-throughs of some key points from the previous slides rather than trying to leave that to interpretation. So one of the key differences is a physical workplace no longer in existence or selectively provided to teams. The other thing that is perhaps more challenging is the organisational cadence isn't explicitly or necessarily provided to a team anymore. So what does that mean? Without a agreed, documented, discussed, negotiated way of working, how does a team necessarily know how to work, how it fits within the organisational structure? And sort of recognise that PMOs can provide a lot of that cadence to teams, where it might be around providing status reports fortnightly or monthly or whatever, but it's something that it's worth pondering a little more, and how can a team sort of work in isolation of an organisation, and what are the things that we need to do to maintain that connectivity. For the team back to the organisation, there are no strike-throughs there, which is kind of suggesting that there's still the same expectation on teams to deliver, to work, to function, to be successful. From the organisation to the individual now, we've got the physical workplace also struck through. Workplace tools have struck through, and sort of recognise that there are some exceptions where the organisation still provides technology tools and whatnot, but there are other examples of tools that are not necessarily available in the virtual world. So things like photocopying facilities or access to certain types of resources, even things like administrative resources is much more compromised. The physical security is no longer there because the physical workplace has obviously changed. And I guess the tangible, the face-to-face, the physical social connectivity has also gone, which, you know, we've sort of heard in the previous slides and presentations about the need to maintain that sense of connection and belonging. Excuse me. Now, from an individual back to the organisation, I've only struck through there the workplace care element, because I guess what this is suggesting is that the individual has his or her own individual workplace that they need to take care of now while still working within a team and working within an organisation. From a team to an individual, I've struck through social connectivity and work cadence there. Really, that's highlighting the physical aspects of those, and then obviously we'll talk through some of the virtual components of connectivity and cadence. And then from an individual back to the team, we've still got the skills, team outputs, and learnings being provided. So out of that sort of analysis, I came up with a couple of key consequences, or call them consequence themes. So there are new and multiple workplaces that exist, even within organisations and within teams. There are new management skills required here, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. There are different work cadences. So I imagine it would be quite challenging for an individual that is working for multiple teams within an organisation to have a work cadence that's going to satisfy both of the team's requirements and then also fit into that organisational context. And finally, and extremely importantly, different ways of connecting and belonging. So going back to the 3-point diagram and trying to put a number of points against each of these. So this virtual world, what does that mean for organisations now? It means a change to the definition of a workplace, changes, if not creation of policies and procedures, and a disrupted work cadence and disrupted productivity. And I've used the word disrupted there consciously. It's not necessarily worse. In some cases it may be better, but it's certainly been challenged and changed. Moving down to the team perspective now, it may be that organisational policies and procedures are unclear or not as accessible now, especially where they're located in a physical location. We will have multiple work cadences emerging across teams, and certainly the feeling that it's harder to stay connected to other people that we are supposed to be working with. So senior management, other teams, other team members, and again, repeating the theme of disrupted work cadence and disrupted productivity. Finally, moving to the individual, this is probably where we're sort of reaching a point or a sharp edge in terms of a lot of these consequences. You know, for a lot of individuals, we're experiencing blurred work-life boundaries, a loss of physical connection to both teams and to individuals, a heavy reliance on our own workplace and our own tools to be complemented by what the organisation provides, and a disrupted work cadence and disrupted productivity. So with that schema presented, what I would like to do now is to provide some other food for thought about each of these perspectives, and then provide some tips and tricks. And again, these are going to be consistent with some of the messaging that we've heard so far. So I've attempted to present this in a novel way. As I mentioned at the start of this slide, consequences are not necessarily good or bad. they may be perceived positively and may actually increase productivity. You know, we've heard some of the good support for agile work practices, but the change in mindset and the change in culture that can require. But I guess the key point here is that each of organisations and teams and individuals can still find it difficult to adapt. So let's start with the organisational perspective and explore this in a little more detail. So the context here is, you know, we've sort of talked around this a little bit today, or implied it. The reason that all of this has happened is COVID-19. And I took a moment to think about why this crisis has been so impactful to the way that we work. So what's interesting, unfortunately, about this is it's not a single localised crisis event. Many of us will remember 9/11, and that was a single point on a single day, which horribly had a series of long-term consequences and loss of life, but it was a single event. Even something more recent, such as the bushfires that happened late in 2019, while they didn't happen on one day, they happened over a relatively contained period of time, and businesses, state governments, federal government were able to respond accordingly. Another challenge with COVID-19 is it certainly feels to me that the status of this has evolved and improved and deteriorated, and almost at different times in different locations. So it sometimes feels really hard to stay up with where we are and what we're supposed to be doing, and how this is going to impact our lives. Third point here is that there are obviously multifold impacts for organisations in different businesses and working in different geographies. So imagine for a moment a business that has an office in Sydney and an office in Melbourne, and you know, we recognise the lockdown in Victoria at the moment. The level of disruption to the business in Melbourne would be very different to that in Sydney, and it will be a challenge for an organisation to manage the consequences across geographies. I think we've all agreed that this will leave a business legacy, some of which will remain the norm. There's certainly been commentary earlier about an appetite and a desire to not go back to the old way of working, but I'm not sure that anybody's really worked out what the new way of working will be. And it's worth imagining that this might actually be a little bit of a pendulum where we've had to go to one extreme, and that has borne some positive fruit in terms of proving that people and teams can be trusted to get on with their work. But there is still this desire for face-to-face and almost this physical reliance or preference for that as well. So some observations about this organisational perspective. Certainly appears as though organisations are working out some policies and procedures on the fly, and would like to emphasise here that some of the less tech-savvy ones are probably a little further behind the environments within which we typically work, at least in terms of the people on this presentation. Work from home policies have often not been documented in the past, and what is a work from home policy, and what are some of the other policies that are going to be put in place to ensure that teams and individuals have the appropriate guardrails in place. Certainly feels as though there's an element of test and learn with respect to business policies and procedures. So how do we cope with the overall volume of meetings? One of the article links are provided at the back is from some analysis that Microsoft did on one of its collaboration tools. And they observed more meetings, but shorter meetings. And I guess that is supported by what we've seen and heard today, and probably experienced as well recently. But how do we cope with that? I think we've also agreed that it can be quite tiring to sit in front of a screen and to look at a screen. So there are some inherent challenges with that. Also, when it comes to training, the idea of training someone via a screen rather than a face-to-face environment I imagine is going to be similarly tiring and draining. From an organisational perspective, there's the need to focus on both remaining viable and also on maintaining reasonable productivity. So what training needs exist? Do managers need to be trained in being an effective manager in a virtual world? I would certainly argue yes. Training in collaboration tools, training in specific delivery techniques, and also importantly, how do we measure the effectiveness of these? I think most of us will agree that certainly in the PMO and the project space, it's always been a challenge to measure, track and report the effectiveness of benefits realisation. When we're talking about this from an overall organisational perspective, it can be quite a challenge. And the final point here in terms of observations is there's certainly greater physical pressure on senior management to both stay in touch and to deliver outcomes. I think we heard from Nicola before about the desire and the completely appropriate desire to have regular touch points with teams. Doing that via meetings rather than face-to-face takes time, takes effort and can be quite draining. So the next slide here, still from the organisational perspective, I really just wanted to share a number of experiences that we've had over the recent times. The intent here is really just to represent some examples that support the points made in the previous slides. So experience with a government department, firstly, it was observed to be very time consuming to manage the COVID response and determine ways of working alongside running the organisation. So decision very early on to virtualise governance forums with ongoing fine tuning, but then the evolution over time to determine which forums were still required and which weren't. Some of them were merged. Interestingly, pop-up training sessions in how to use collaboration tools, and these were not done by or trained through training organisations. They were really done by people within the organisation that understood how to use tools more effectively and at least drive a level of consistency of use. Third point here is the leaders certainly walk the talk by providing regular comms, showing their own work environment, their home environment, and recognise the impacts of working from home on productivity. So sort of really supporting some of the points made already about the need to be active and visible and present. And one of the other responses that I noticed there was establishment of no-fly zones at an organisational level, not just at a team level. So the values of these were multifold. One was to ensure that senior managers could be contacted urgently if required by phone, but also to give people the opportunity to have non-meeting time and to get on with some of the other things that they were accountable for doing. So typically no-fly zones were established during the middle of the day, and there was also one day a week where the mornings were completely blocked out as a no-fly zone. Another observation in a financial services organisation, it was almost as challenging to maintain contact with external stakeholders as it was with internal stakeholders. After a period of test and learn of whether this could be done virtually, it was agreed that this was more effectively managed from a physical head office with use of physical Kanban boards rather than virtual ones. And another consequence was the high volume of meetings and demands for information led to significant overtime of those resources. So feedback to me was certainly was a slog and difficult at times to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and appropriate reinforcement of the good work being done by rewards and recognition was a key motivator in ensuring focus there too. Experience with a university, obviously with students not being able to return from overseas, face-to-face education services could no longer be provided. And even for those students in Australia, changes to the nature of learning. So there was a pivot to virtual services during COVID-19 and a reset of targets. Very clearly a move to shorter and more chunked education events. So the traditional idea of perhaps a 2-hour tutorial or a half-day tutorial, was observed to be draining, and feedback provided was that where those sorts of sessions could be chunked down, they were more effective. Another important point there is that virtual services are recognised to be needed in future, but it's unclear how many. So the strategy certainly appeared to be evolving and will continue to evolve. The final point is a government authority sort of recognised that for a key program of work, with sort of the culture and the tools and the nature of the program of work, it was decided to pause it until a suitable work environment could be restored. So it's interesting that in our old world, I'm sure many of us will agree that it's very rare to see projects paused but restarted at a later point. But in this case, there's an example of organisations making those conscious decisions. So moving now to some key tips from the organisational perspective. It's important to define and communicate remote working policies. They may be understood or implied, but the more transparent they can be, the better. Identifying the best tools and processes to support teams and individuals and to communicate them. Really important for senior leadership to walk the talk, be accessible, provide regular comms, and almost be the face to the organisation into the virtual world. And we also need to recognise the impacts that might have to the individual roles for in senior leadership positions. Excuse me. Identifying and prioritising training needs for the virtual environment. So those could be, again, training in virtual tools, training needs in potentially how to be a manager, and I'm sure there are others that will be relevant in your own environments. Excuse me. Prioritising team and individual support through multiple and relevant channels. So that means not only providing opportunities for teams to check in and maintain connection to the organisation, but also ways for individuals to remain connected, especially if they may be struggling or in need of help. Final point here is to identify and manage cross-team, virtual team and individual business metrics. So that goes back to the point of, how do we measure that we're doing things in an effective way and sort of dealing with the challenges and the disruption that we're all experiencing. Moving now to the team perspective, a point around going back to theory, I guess, and I guess this was a novel thought at the time. It's good practice for any team to establish a way of working up front, and I think we would take that as read. But we often have used Tuckman's model where we talk about team formation and team effectiveness, certainly in the BC world. And my last joke of the day is, before COVID, BC had a different meaning, but BC sort of seems to have taken on a new meaning now. So how long did it take for teams to form and storm in the previous world? I think most would accept that it was at least weeks, if not months. And, while many of us will have had the luxury of pre-existing relationships upon which to rely, and the trust that is inherent in those pre-existing relationships, we can't necessarily assume or rely on that in our current world. And I was very interested to hear that word trust from Neil earlier on today, because one of the ways that teams work effectively is with a high level of trust. So I've included in the top right-hand corner the Tuckman model for those that are not familiar or it's not sort of current in their minds. So just take a moment to consider where your team or the teams that you're responsible for might be on this curve in the virtual world. So a handful of observations here around the team perspective. If a team was established pre-COVID-19, then it's certainly likely to be more cohesive. But importantly, we'll still need to adjust its way of working. And even more strongly than that, a team that has come together post-COVID-19 will need the time to establish its way of working. So what are some examples of that, of what that means? That could mean documentation of team charters, team principles, how the team works within the organisational context, team cadences, when we're going to meet, and are we going to meet socially, virtually, as well as for work purposes. The way of working with other teams feels less organic than before. Certainly where organisations have worked with vendors and offshore organisations in the recent past, it will already feel less organic to some extent, but even teams within our own organisations now can feel more difficult to have that close relationship, because we can't walk around and say hello to the manager. We can't organise a quick stand-up meeting or thrash things out quickly. We do need to go back to our virtual world to do that. Team support for individuals appears inconsistent in maintaining work-life balance. So what that means is I've noticed that where a team manager has a preferred or even a hardwired, if you will, style of managing, then that can still be the expectation for the team members. And, if that means working long hours or working at different hours of the day or even working weekends, then that can be quite a challenge. And the final observation here is that there's an element of test and learn in all of this, and we've certainly heard test and learn mentioned a few times. This really is new ground for many teams, and again, especially the less tech-savvy ones. So a number of experiences about the team perspective. I've observed in a large financial services organisation, the explicit definition of virtual work cadences and even work locations at a team level so that productivity could be maintained. So they've had the concept of A teams and B teams. That means that a team might be scheduled to work in the physical office for a certain week and then the other team on the following week, or even specifically on certain days of the week, and also the prioritisation of resources for customer-facing teams, which are the reason for the business to exist in the first place. Also noticed a government authority organising not only organisation level events such as quarantini drinks, often on a Friday afternoon, with people's virtual or real drinks in hand, but also organising team level events, a team level social chat, team level milestone and recognition events. And I've observed that having both those organisational level events and team level events is more effective than just having the organisational level events. And then moving across to the government department, I sort of expanded on this in a little more detail in the previous slide. I've sort of observed that the work-life balance can and has been sometimes dictated by a team manager, still in a top-down approach rather than being dictated by individual circumstances, which is more bottom-up. And I think to the theme of empowerment, as long as we get that balance right of the top-down requirement for work to be done by a certain date and in an appropriately quality way, and having that balance with the individual circumstances, then that would appear to be a reasonable level of flex. The final experience here was in another financial services organisation. There was explicit awareness and understanding of team members' circumstances and challenges, and allowed team members to provide personal and professional support as well as the organisation. So, and those can be quite soft ways of providing personal support, personal check-ins, understanding of people's circumstances, for example, where they may have needed to move residences, or other changes in their family or personal life. So the last perspective, one more slide on the team perspective here before I move into the personal perspective. Take the time to establish the team's own way of working and the way of working with other teams. Acknowledge the productivity impacts and acknowledge that not every team member will feel the same. Take the time to set some cadences of how the team is going to work and when they're going to work, and establish some communication boundaries. What that might mean if you're a member of an agile team is, well, we agree that we have a daily stand-up at 9 o'clock, and not necessarily that it might be at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday and 8 o'clock on a Wednesday and 9:30 on a Friday. Having appropriate cadences does tend to provide individuals, at least in my experience, with some sense of where the workday boundary is from the personal life. So it's important to maintain those connection points into all of senior management, into other teams, and also with the individual team members. Where we're really going with this is the support of the individual's work-life balance and explicitly considering the social connection that an organisation and a team can provide an individual. Provide safe ways to provide feedback or to seek help, and formally monitor and revise over time. Again, I think most of us would agree that teams are sort of learning a little as they go and won't have everything right the first time. So the last couple of slides that I've got here before I move into the summary are around the individual perspective. So the context here is that not every individual will feel the same in the virtual world, and everyone is likely to feel both positives and negatives. And there was an interesting point made before about the potential waste from the Six Sigma model in transportation. And I think that probably needs to be balanced with the need for some individuals to get into the work mode. And certainly there has been literature around individuals sometimes using travel time to get into work mode, and almost prioritising the day and working out who they need to speak to while they're travelling there. So it can be a challenge for individuals to get into work mode where their office is 10 metres from where they wake up in the morning. A physical office does provide separation from physical separation from small children, home issues and other personal clutter. And I guess some observations here are that we need to acknowledge that individuals may have struggles. Productivity is not uniform. And a thought prompter here is, how does employee assistance work virtually, and have teams and organisations taken the time to think about that and related areas. It certainly can be hard to see and hear how people are coping with working virtually, and I would argue this is a very strong advantage of having faces and at least having video while speaking to someone, as a way of connecting with them visually at least. And obviously people may express their coping mechanisms in different ways. If you're the sort of person that taps your foot up and down underneath the desk as a way of releasing stress, then that's not necessarily something that's going to come through on a computer screen. It is very important to check in both professionally and socially using those multiple mechanisms. It's easy to ignore things like occupational health and safety. I did some contract work earlier this year, and the the agency that I did some work through there for that short period of time actually asked that individuals took photos of their home work area to demonstrate that at least the basics were in place, and that seemed like quite a good approach at the time, because obviously these things can't be inspected with physical eyes. And the final point around all of this is, I think we talked about this a little bit before, working virtually is a skill. It's something that we are learning, it's something that we are getting better at, but it's important to recognise it as a skill. I thought I'd share on this next slide just a few of my own experiences as an individual, and sort of reminding myself about how I like to work. I personally prefer to start later and to work later. For me, a regular starting time is important. It may not be that way for others, but certainly is for me. A routine before starting work is important for me. That could even be a walk to get a coffee or something like that, where I am working at home. Switching off the news, I think it can be a distraction, if we're hearing the same sorts of things day after day. My own preference is for chill music or no music at all. The radio station that I like to listen to is 39, if anybody listens to that, which is SBS Chill. Take breaks during the day, and this sort of goes back to those physical elements before, stretching your legs, stretching your shoulders, refocusing the eyes, taking a mental pause, sharing how well you're travelling, acknowledging that you'll have good days as well as ordinary days, and listen to your body overall.
Sorry, Pete, can you summarise now, because we're going a bit beyond time? Yeah,
will do. All right, so we're up to the last slide here now with tips from an individual perspective. Be self-aware, be self-disciplined, and understand what works and doesn't work for you. Resist the temptation to multitask. I have included in the back of the pack an interesting video from the BBC, which sort of reminds us that multitasking is inefficient. Get into work mode and maintain a work-life balance by structuring the day. Monitor OH&S, physical health and signs of fatigue, and monitor mental health as well. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Peter.